In the autumn of 1895, when the leaves rotted faster than they fell and the fog clung low as breath held too long, the hollow lay hidden between hills that no map bothered to name. The trees grew close there, bending inward like listeners, their roots knotted together beneath the soil as if they shared a single, buried thought. No road led in. No trail led out. Those who lived within the hollow said the woods did not like witnesses. The sisters had been born there, one after another, like the final notes of a song sung too many times. Each carried the same pale eyes, the same narrow faces sharpened by hunger and silence. They were not old women, but the hollow had aged them early, carving patience and fear into their bones. They knew every sound the forest made, every creak, every warning crack of branch, and they knew which noises meant to bar the doors and which meant to light the lamps and pray. Nothing had grown properly in years. Crops failed in careful rows. Livestock birthed weak and died quietly. Even the graves seemed crowded, earth sinking as if the ground itself were tired of holding the dead. The bloodline was thinning. Everyone knew it, though no one spoke it aloud. To name the rot was to invite it closer. When the stranger collapsed near the creek, bleeding into the moss, the forest went silent. He was not from the hollow. That was clear in the way his clothes were cut, in the softness of his hands, in the way his eyes searched the trees as if expecting them to part and explain themselves. He did not know the old rules. He did not know that the hollow had been waiting. The sisters stood over him as dusk fell, the forest tightening around them. For a moment, none of them moved. Somewhere deep in the woods, something old and patient listened, remembering what had been promised long before any of them were born. In 1895, the hollow that the world had all but forgotten was in a state of quiet desperation. Nestled between hills so steep and close that sunlight barely touched the ground, it had long been isolated from the outside world. To an outsider, it might have appeared as little more than a forgotten patch of forest, but to those who lived there, it was a fragile, living organism, one that had already begun to wither. Unlike ordinary decay caused by famine or disease, the hollow's sickness was far more subtle and sinister. It was the slow collapse of a bloodline, the kind of erosion that happens over generations when the lifeblood of a family, the children, the heirs, the continuation of a name, ceases to arrive. Families had once thrived here, tending the sparse fields and raising children who learned the language of the forest before the language of men. But in recent years, births had grown rare. Young men and women either fled when they could, fell ill mysteriously, or passed away in ways too strange to be explained, leaving the sisters, the last caretakers of the lineage, to confront a truth they had been trying to ignore: their hollow was dying. This decline was not just a matter of numbers. Every failed harvest, every sickly animal, every hushed funeral seemed to feed into a growing awareness that the land itself was entwined with the fate of its people. It was as though the forest, the soil, and the wind remembered the strength of the family and now mourned its weakening. Shadows seemed longer here, not simply because of the dense canopy overhead, but because the absence of life had created a hollow in the world that light could not fully reach. The air carried a weight, a quiet pressure that pressed against lungs and hearts alike, reminding those who remained that time was slipping past, and with it, the chance to preserve what they were meant to guard. To the sisters, each year that passed without new life felt like an added stitch unraveling from a tapestry, leaving gaps that would never be mended. The forest seemed to lean in closer, watching, listening, and waiting. It was patient, almost sentient in its observation, and it was not indifferent. It demanded continuity, and with every passing year of childless solitude, the hollow's demands grew more insistent, more urgent. The dying bloodline was not a secret in the hollow, though it was spoken of only in whispers, careful and measured, because to name it too loudly felt like tempting fate. The sisters knew, deep in their marrow, that the survival of the hollow was bound to the survival of their line, and that each lost opportunity was not just the absence of a child, but a thread in the fabric of the hollow itself being severed, leaving an emptiness that even time could not fill. The three sisters had grown up in the hollow, each shaped by its suffocating isolation and the heavy weight of expectation that came with their family name. From the moment they could walk, they were taught that the survival of the hollow depended not on outsiders, but on them, on their ability to carry forward a lineage that had already begun to falter. Their parents had long passed, leaving them with fragmented lessons, cryptic warnings, and the looming responsibility of a bloodline that teetered on the edge of extinction. It was whispered among the shadows of the house and the murmurs of the forest that without them, the hollow would not endure, that the land itself seemed to tie its vitality to the family's continuity. The sisters understood this in a way that was almost instinctual, an unspoken knowledge that threaded through their dreams and waking hours alike. They walked the woods alone, speaking to no one, listening to the wind as though it carried answers, but found only questions echoing back. The weight of their isolation pressed on them, shaping every choice and every glance toward the world beyond the dense tree line that encircled them. Yet even with their careful vigilance, they knew the hollow was dying. The few men left in the surrounding areas had either vanished or succumbed to misfortune long before reaching maturity, leaving the sisters to contemplate the cruel arithmetic of their future. They realized that no amount of tending crops, maintaining the house, or preserving traditions could counteract the stark truth. Without intervention, the hollow's lineage would vanish entirely. This knowledge created a tension that simmered beneath the surface of their daily routines, a constant hum of urgency that guided their movements and decisions. They watched the trees sway as if signaling warnings they could barely understand, and in the quietest moments of the night, the sisters would speak softly among themselves, rehearsing plans and possibilities, weighing morality against necessity, survival against conscience. Each day brought a new awareness of time slipping away, of the delicate thread that held their family's fate suspended over the abyss of extinction. They understood that the survival of their home was no longer a matter of chance, but of action, and that action would require courage the hollow itself had not demanded before. In every creaking floorboard, in every rustle of the undergrowth, the sisters felt the pulse of the land, a silent reminder that the hollow was alive in its own way and that it required them to act, not merely to exist. Their duty was clear, even if the path forward was fraught with shadows, moral ambiguity, and the unknown. It was not enough to preserve the house or the fields, they had to preserve themselves, their blood, and the fragile promise that the hollow's story could continue, even as every moment of indecision drew it closer to a silence that could never be undone. The hollow had long carried its own superstitions, whispered truths that the sisters learned before they could even speak properly. The woods themselves seemed to demand secrecy, bending over the narrow paths like watchful sentinels, and the very air seemed heavy with remembrance. Stories of malformed births, of children who had been stillborn or born sickly and fragile, were spoken of only in hushed tones, if at all. They were not tales for outsiders, they were warnings, lessons, and acknowledgments of the weight the forest and the family bore together. At night, when the wind rose through the trees and rattled the shutters, the sisters would hear their own voices repeating prayers that had been passed down through generations, strange incantations that blended the sacred and the fearful, pleading not for wealth or health, but for forgiveness and for the survival of a lineage that the hollow itself seemed intent on reclaiming. The prayers were a private contract with something ancient, an understanding that life here had to be protected even if the means were dark. Every year without a new birth felt like a small betrayal, a failure that rippled outward through the hollow's tangled network of roots and soil. Livestock would falter, crops would shrivel, and even the shadows in the corners of the house seemed sharper, more judgmental, as though the hollow itself could sense that the sisters were running out of time. Villagers from beyond the hills would sometimes speak of strange lights flickering between the trees at night or of muffled sounds that carried too far and too clearly to belong to ordinary life. The sisters never ventured near those rumors, but they knew they were not baseless. The hollow had its own memory, and its memory was long and unforgiving. They had learned to interpret every rustle in the underbrush, every unnatural stillness in the air, as a communication they were bound to heed. The malformed births, the whispered prayers, the constant vigilance, all of it was part of an invisible ledger the hollow kept, marking the family's successes and failures alike. There was no room for error, no luxury of ignoring the signs. Every misstep, every hesitation, was noted not only by the sisters but by the land itself, and the consequences were never far behind. It was as if the very soil had become a living witness, recording every whispered fear, every muted cry, every desperate hope, and holding it close. The sisters carried this weight like a physical burden, feeling it in the tightening of their shoulders and the restless tension in their limbs, understanding that the hollow's patience was finite. Every night, when the candles flickered and shadows danced across the walls, they felt the enormity of their responsibility pressing in, a reminder that the whispers of the past were never idle, and that the survival of the Hollow, their home, and their bloodline depended on honoring every word, every prayer, every cautious decision made under the watchful eyes of the ancient forest surrounding them. The discovery of the old family ledger changed everything for the sisters, though it arrived quietly, almost as if the Hollow itself had guided it into their hands. It was hidden beneath loose floorboards in the oldest part of the house, a dust-covered volume bound in cracked leather that smelled faintly of earth and time. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, written in spidery, precise handwriting that spoke of generations long gone, each name and date a record of births, deaths, and the strange, almost obsessive attention the family had paid to lineage. As the sisters turned the pages, a chill settled over them, not the cold of the autumn wind seeping through the shutters, but a deep, gnawing recognition that the ledger was more than a record. It was a mandate, a contract between the family and the Hollow itself. Every branch of their bloodline, every marriage and child, was accounted for with meticulous care, and with each passing generation, the ledger seemed to grow more insistent, more urgent, as if it had been waiting for them to arrive. The sisters traced the names of ancestors who had vanished mysteriously, noting the gaps where no children had been born and the strange annotations in margins that hinted at remedies, rituals, or sacrifices performed to ensure continuation. The message was clear: the bloodline had a purpose, a responsibility that transcended the desires or fears of any single individual. The ledger seemed almost alive under their fingertips, as though it pulsed with the same quiet heartbeat they had felt in the walls and floors of the house, a rhythm that matched the Hollow itself. The sisters understood, perhaps for the first time in full, that the survival of their home, of the fields, the livestock, even the very soil, was tied to the persistence of their family's line. It was no longer a matter of choice or morality, it was necessity. They could see it in the ledger's pages, in the stories of ancestors who had acted boldly or cruelly in the name of survival. The Hollow had always demanded this continuity, and now the ledger made the stakes undeniable. Their isolation, their quiet lives, their careful tending of the land, had all been preparation for a moment they could not fully yet imagine, when the ledger's instructions would have to be followed, however grim. The sisters exchanged glances, recognizing in one another the same understanding, the same sense of inevitability. The ledger had illuminated what they already knew deep in their bones: the Hollow would not endure without them, and their bloodline was the fragile, essential thread holding it together. To ignore its message would be to invite ruin, not only upon themselves but upon the land that had nurtured them, the forests that had enclosed them, and the Hollow that had become both home and prison. It was a revelation heavy with both dread and clarity, forcing them to confront the lengths they would have to go to ensure that the Hollow's story did not end with them, that the ledger's record would continue to be written, page by page, name by name, into the future that had not yet come. The stranger appeared on the edge of the Hollow like a shadow that had slipped from another world, stumbling into the sisters' carefully contained existence without warning. He was young, though his face was lined with fatigue and fear, as if life outside the Hollow had already beaten him down before he even reached its threshold. His clothes were torn, caked with mud, and his boots left irregular prints in the soft, moss-covered ground, evidence of a journey neither straight nor safe. He carried no papers, no possessions of note, only the blood on his hands and the exhaustion in his limbs, a silent testament to whatever misfortune had driven him into the forest's embrace. The sisters discovered him collapsed near the creek that cut a shallow line through the Hollow, a place they often passed but rarely disturbed. At first, they did not speak, only watched, their pale eyes assessing him as one might a curious animal, measuring strength, vulnerability, and the potential consequences of intervention. He breathed raggedly, coughing up the residue of travel, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven rhythms, and they knew immediately that he was not from their world, not of the Hollow, not of the lineage that had bound them for generations. His arrival was a disruption, a ripple in the stagnant waters of their secluded existence, and yet it was also an opportunity, though the nature of that opportunity was not yet clear even to them. As they approached, moving with the silent, careful grace that the forest had taught them, the stranger's eyes flickered open, revealing a mixture of terror and confusion. He saw the sisters, tall, pale, and unnervingly still, and instinctively recoiled, as though sensing that these figures were not simply caretakers or neighbors but guardians of some ancient and unknowable order. He tried to speak, but words failed him. His voice was hoarse, cracked by cold, hunger, and fear, and the hollow seemed to swallow his attempts before they could travel far. The sisters did not answer, instead leading him slowly toward their home, guiding him as much by gesture as by voice, their hands gentle but firm. There was an unspoken understanding between them. He was now part of their world, whether he wished it or not, and the hollow would not release him easily. Even as they tended to his wounds, offering water and warmth, the forest around them seemed to lean closer, listening, noting, as though aware that this stranger represented both danger and salvation, a catalyst whose presence could tip the delicate balance the sisters had fought to maintain. In their careful observation of him, in their quiet assessment of his strengths and weaknesses, they began to understand that he was more than a lost traveler. He was a variable in the ledger of the hollow, an unexpected entry whose fate might determine the continuation of everything they had long sought to protect, though neither he nor they yet realized the full weight of the role he had been thrust into. The decision to act was neither sudden nor simple. It unfolded like a slow, suffocating pressure, pressing against the sisters' hearts and minds until it became unbearable. They had always known the hollow demanded obedience, but the arrival of the stranger crystallized their dilemma, forcing them to weigh morality against survival, compassion against necessity. 4 days, they watched him sleep, watched him awaken with confusion and hesitation, unaware of the invisible threads that now bound him to their home. The sisters debated quietly in corners of the house, their voices low and cautious, carrying only far enough to reach one another, because even the wind seemed to listen. One sister argued that it was wrong, that no outsider should be subjected to the whims of the hollow or the needs of a bloodline. Another countered that the hollow had always demanded sacrifices and that their family's survival outweighed any individual life, that the land, the forests, and even the very walls of the house were counting on them to act decisively. The debate twisted and turned, looping back on itself, until they realized there was no moral path that did not lead to compromise. The stranger had stumbled into their world unprepared, unknowing, and yet he carried within him the potential to ensure that the hollow did not vanish entirely. The sisters understood that passivity was no longer an option. To hesitate was to fail both the hollow and themselves. Their decision was made quietly, in the soft hours before dawn, when the house lay shivering in the cold light of early morning and shadows pooled in the corners like ink. They moved with deliberate care, tending to his wounds, offering sustenance, and speaking in tones that carried both gentleness and authority. It was not an act of cruelty, but of preparation, a guiding of fate into a channel that had been mapped long before his arrival. They taught him the routines of the hollow, the ways to move silently through the woods, the rituals that kept the land calm and the animals from noticing. Every gesture was layered with double meaning, every word a subtle instruction, though he remained blissfully ignorant of the true purpose behind their actions. Outside, the forest seemed to respond, as though it could sense the alignment of necessity and intent. Winds shifted, branches creaked in acknowledgement, and the air thickened with an unspoken expectation. The sisters were careful to maintain the illusion of hospitality, even as they wove a web of inevitability around him. They understood that once he realized the hollow's needs, once he comprehended the debt his presence now implied, it would be too late to turn back. The choice they had made was not simply theirs, it belonged to the hollow as much as it did to the sisters, a covenant that had been waiting for the right moment to assert itself. In choosing to act, they embraced a path from which there would be no retreat, and the weight of that path settled over them like the dark, patient canopy of trees that had always watched and waited, knowing that the hollow's survival demanded this terrible, deliberate step forward. The sisters nursed the stranger with careful precision, though their ministrations were as much about control as they were about care. Each movement, each cup of water, each cloth pressed to a wound, was measured and deliberate, part of a larger plan they had rehearsed in their minds countless times before his arrival. They did not speak of what they were doing, not in words he could understand, not in tones that betrayed the truth of the hollow's expectations. To him, it seemed like simple compassion, a natural response to his injuries and exhaustion, but beneath the surface, every gesture was a preparation, a shaping of him to fit into a world he did not yet know existed. They tended to his fever with the herbs they cultivated carefully in the shadowed corners of the house, grinding roots and leaves into bitter teas that soothed pain but sharpened awareness. When he murmured questions about where he was, about the strange isolation of the place, the sisters would answer vaguely, offering stories of the woods, of the small settlements beyond the hills, and of old paths that had long been abandoned. They guided him gently but firmly, teaching him which corners of the forest were safe to walk, which streams could be trusted for water, and which silence must never be broken, as if the forest itself were a living entity that required obedience. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to mirror their movements, following their routines without fully understanding why. They noticed the way he flinched at sudden noises, the way his gaze swept the trees as if expecting them to betray secrets, and they adjusted their teaching, coaxing him into a rhythm that aligned with the hollow's peculiar demands. The process was painstaking and exhausting, yet necessary, because the hollow required more than mere presence. It required harmony, an unspoken understanding that every breath, every step, every thought must be tempered by respect for the unseen rules that governed the place. The sisters themselves were not unaware of the moral weight of their actions, though they justified it as survival, as the only path to ensure that the bloodline they guarded, and the hollow itself, would endure. In the quiet hours of the night, when the stranger finally slept deeply, untroubled for the first time since he arrived, the sisters would gather in corners of the house and speak softly to one another, tracing the contours of their plan, refining the next steps. They were aware that his ignorance was both fragile and essential, a delicate balance between trust and manipulation, and that the moment he understood fully would alter everything. Yet for now, as they watched him breathe in the lamplight, as they ensured that the hollow's pulse remained steady around him, they allowed themselves a sliver of satisfaction. He was being shaped, unwittingly, into the vessel the hollow demanded, and with each careful touch, each whispered instruction, the sisters edged closer to the fulfillment of a necessity they had long feared but could no longer avoid, guiding him into a role he had yet to realize he had been chosen to play. As winter closed in, the hollow began to shift in ways the sisters had long sensed but rarely witnessed so clearly. The forest around the house seemed to awaken with a deliberate awareness, each branch, each root, each fallen leaf moving as though in concert with a single, patient consciousness. The wind carried a weight that pressed against the skin and settled in the bones, whispering through the skeletal trees in low, mournful sighs that seemed meant only for the sisters. Even the snow, when it finally began to fall, did so unevenly, collecting more heavily in certain patches, leaving paths visible and invisible at will, guiding and constraining at the same time. Animals moved differently as well, their usual routines disrupted, their glances more intent, as though they too recognized the stranger's presence and the subtle shift it had caused in the hollow's delicate balance. The sisters noticed the smallest changes, the snap of a brittle twig, the way the shadows elongated unnaturally in the late afternoon, the hush of the forest floor when nothing stirred. It was as if the hollow itself were testing them, assessing whether their careful planning and quiet preparation had aligned properly with its ancient demands. The stranger, still unaware of the full weight of the situation, began to feel the oppressive influence of the woods in ways that unsettled him. Paths seemed longer, streams farther away, and familiar landmarks became strange and disorienting. At night, when the wind rattled the windows and the forest moaned in response, he would wake in a panic, unsure of whether he had moved in his sleep or if the trees themselves had shifted positions around him. The sisters watched these reactions with a mixture of satisfaction and concern, understanding that the forest's influence was a tool as much as it was a warning. The woods demanded obedience, and the stranger had to adapt or falter. The sisters' own routines became more rigid, more deliberate, synchronized with the rhythms of the hollow. Meals were prepared at precise times, fires stoked to exact specifications, and every door and shutter inspected multiple times a day, all in alignment with the invisible cues from the outside. Even in moments of quiet, when the stranger slept, the sisters could feel the forest's pulse pressing against the walls, whispering reminders of necessity, of the ancient covenant that bound them to the hollow's survival. They knew the forest would not wait, it would respond to hesitation or error with consequences that could not be reversed. In tending to him, in guiding his steps and shaping his awareness, they had to remain vigilant not only for his sake but for the hollow's, ensuring that the alignment between human intention and natural will remained intact. The forest's reactions, subtle and relentless, reminded them at every turn that the hollow was alive, and that its watchful presence would never slacken, shaping the fates of those within it whether they understood the rules or not. The stranger's awakening to the reality of the hollow was slow and insidious, creeping into his mind like fog rolling over the hills, soft at first but relentless in its spread. At first, he believed he had stumbled into an unusually secluded homestead, a place untouched by neighbors and strangers, perhaps forgotten by maps and men alike. But the longer he stayed, the more subtle cues began to unravel his assumptions. Doors that he thought he could walk through seemed to close themselves quietly behind him, or else led him to corners he did not expect. Paths he had followed yesterday appeared altered, subtly rerouted, lined with unfamiliar undergrowth or fallen branches that had not been there before. The house, once a simple shelter, revealed itself as a labyrinth of rooms and hallways, each echoing with a weight of expectation he could not name. At night, the sisters' routines, previously innocuous in his eyes, began to take on a rhythm that felt both inescapable and oppressive. Their pale eyes seemed to follow him in silent scrutiny, measuring, judging, recording, and their movements hinted at knowledge far beyond what they shared. The forest outside mirrored this vigilance. Shadows deepened unnaturally, the wind carried whispers he could not interpret, and even the animals behaved as if aware of the invisible rules governing his every step. Slowly, the stranger realized that the hollow was not merely a home or a piece of land, but a living, breathing entity, bound to the sisters and to their family's legacy in ways that demanded obedience and submission. Attempts to leave were thwarted by confusion or sudden obstacles. A path that seemed clear became impassable, the creek swelled unnaturally, snow fell where it had not fallen before, and the woods themselves seemed to conspire to redirect him back toward the house. Panic began to edge into his thoughts as he noticed the subtle web that had been spun around him, every routine, every whispered instruction, every small act of guidance now taking on a heavier significance. The hollow was patient, silent, and unyielding, yet it remembered everything, each misstep, each hesitation, each tiny transgression. He understood at last that he was trapped not by walls or chains but by rules older and more rigid than any law he had known, that the hollow itself demanded his presence and participation. The sisters had not lied, nor had they deceived him in the traditional sense. They had prepared him, slowly, inexorably, for the role he was now beginning to recognize he could not escape. Awareness settled over him like a weight, pressing into his chest, constricting his thoughts, and with it came the realization that the hollow's patience was finite, and that any attempt to resist or defy would be met not with leniency, but with consequences he could not yet imagine. Every sound of wind through the trees, every creak in the floorboards, every glance from the sisters reinforced the same truth. He had become part of the hollow, and in becoming part of it, he had also become a keeper of its demands, whether he wished it or not. The true horror of the hollow revealed itself not in the stranger's arrival or the sisters' careful planning, but in the realization that the place remembered every choice, every sacrifice, every transgression that had occurred within its boundaries. The forest, the house, and even the soil itself seemed to carry a consciousness older than the oldest living trees, a memory that preserved not only names and dates but the intentions and fears of those who had walked its paths. It was as if the hollow itself kept ledger-like accounts, tallying what had been done and what had been withheld, watching as generations unfolded and vanished. The sisters had always known, in some deep, instinctual way, that their actions were being observed, measured against expectations that transcended human understanding, but the stranger's presence made the hollow's scrutiny undeniable. Every step he took, every hesitation, every fearful glance into the woods seemed to awaken the hollow further, stirring echoes of long-forgotten ceremonies, abandoned rituals, and the desperate acts of ancestors who had fought to preserve the family line. The memory of these actions clung to the air, settling in the corners of the house and in the spaces between the trees, tangible and heavy. The hollow did not merely demand continuation of bloodlines, it demanded recognition, acknowledgement, and participation in the ongoing covenant that bound the land to its people. In subtle ways, it tested the stranger, presenting obstacles and creating conditions that forced him to respond according to the unspoken rules that governed the sisters and the hollow itself. He began to see traces of prior tragedies, graves carefully tended but long empty, the skeletal remains of small animals arranged in patterns that seemed ritualistic, remnants of herbs and burned offerings whose purposes had been forgotten by all except the land. The sisters themselves were vessels of the hollow's memory, carriers of knowledge they could not always articulate, their pale eyes and precise movements reflecting an awareness of the covenant that far exceeded human comprehension. The stranger understood, finally, that he had been drawn into a system that measured not just survival but obedience, not just loyalty but complicity, and that the hollow remembered everything, punishing lapses in subtle but inexorable ways. The weight of this realization settled upon him like the oppressive snow-laden branches pressing against the windows, and in that moment, he recognized that the Hollow's demands were not abstract, they were living, relentless, and absolute. Every whispered prayer, every shadowed glance, every careful step the sisters had taken to shape him was part of a continuum stretching back generations, a chain of decisions and sacrifices that he could neither undo nor ignore. The forest and the house themselves seemed to hum with awareness, reminding him that the Hollow's memory was long, patient, and unforgiving, that its reckoning was not just with those who entered willingly but with anyone who dared to cross its borders, and that the survival of the bloodline depended on adherence to rules older than law, older than conscience, older than life itself.